623, it is 11 February 2021. This is from Fort Observer. In focus, Trump supporters learning the hard way about digital privacy. In an expose on the Capitol protests and riot, the New York Times explains how geolocation data enabled investigators to identify specific protesters and their travel activity before, during, and after the protest and riot. An alleged source provided this geolocation data dump out of outrage over the event and a concern that this data could be obtained and used for nefarious purposes. There's actually a link to the, in Fort Observer, there's a link to the article. An alleged source provided, journalists were able to reconstruct the day and match geolocation data to over 2,000 identities, including email addresses, birthdays, ethnicities, ages, and more. The article, which recounts the day's events of one specific individual based on this supposedly anonymous data, is a great example of the disparity among activists on the right and the left. Left-wing activists, especially those carrying out disruptive and violent actions, continually stress the need for operation security measures. Lists of best practices are routinely circulated, often warning activists to carry either burner phones or no phones at all. As the New York Times warns, there are protesters movements could be bought and sold to innumerable parties for years, and the threat that those movements could be tied back to their identity will never go away. Left-wing groups are essentially professional activists in that they've built a culture and doctrine around their activities. They've explained how the left is focusing on building logistics, communications, and intelligence networks that enable their disruptive protests and violent activism. There really is no equivalent effort on the right, and certainly nothing this deliberate. Trump supporters who took part in the Capitol riot are learning the hard way the lessons that left-wing activist groups have promoted for years. Again, in focus, another topic. House Homeland Security Committee on Domestic Terror. The House Homeland Security Committee held a hearing last week on domestic terrorist threats. Although left-wing extremist groups such as anarchists and anti-fascist revolutionaries were mentioned, the hearing largely focused on right-wing groups. Experts opined on the need for government action, including a focus on information sharing by state fusion centers, created as a response to the 9/11 attacks. Elizabeth Neumann, former DHS Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention, warned of a quote-unquote high likelihood of violent attacks against infrastructure and mainstream media, law enforcement, big tech, and elected officials. She explained that this threat comes from Trump supporters who believe the election was stolen and compared Trump supporters to Islamic State supporters. Neumann believes the government will be fighting domestic terrorism for 10 to 20 years. There were also calls for more legislation, such as the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. Brian Jenkins of the RAND Corporation warned that creating a domestic provision of the USA Patriot Act, which would designate a list of domestic terror groups, would lead to confusion about the differences between extremist groups and terrorist groups. Under a law like this, Jenkins suggested that there are hundreds of extremist groups on the political right and left that could be designated as terrorist groups under a new law. The Observer's first takeaway is that there seemed to be a widespread agreement that prosecuting domestic extremist and terror cases should be easier for federal prosecutors. That could be reflected in future legislation that lowers the bar of what's considered extremist activity. Jenkins indicated that the unintended consequences of new legislation that essentially creates new extremist and terrorist groups through vague or broad definitions. Neumann warned that government action could be misperceived or misrepresented to cause more radicalization. Both are very valid concerns. Another takeaway is that efforts to arrest and prosecute should be expanded in order to deter extremist activities. Committee members and some witnesses in this hearing suggested that homegrown extremist and terrorist movements should be combated in the same way Islamist extremists and terrorists were post 9/11. That's virtually certain to mean increased surveillance of mainstream social media and alternative platforms like Gab, Telegram, and online forums. There were calls for Section 230 reform that would hold social media companies accountable for extremist talk or hate speech on their platform, essentially forcing a more active role by big tech companies to police their own platforms. A federal response is likely to include public-private efforts to better enable these platforms to monitor and report extremist activity. We could also see 9/11 era security measures freshly applied to U.S. citizens. There's been talk of adding known and suspected extremists to the no-fly list. At a minimum, secondary screening requirements are likely to be applied to suspected extremists. Airline boarding passes will contain the 4 S's, which denotes a secondary screening requirement. There will likely be additional security measures taken that don't require new legislation. In at least some states, law enforcement officers who pull up your driver's license can see if there's a concealed carry permit attached. There may be something similar attached to the records of those suspected of extremist activity. Low-intensity conflict in some. Leftists march in D.C. in the face of heightened security. Black Bloc anti-fascists and other leftists marched through the streets of Washington, D.C. during the first in a series of disruptions organized by the anti-state abolitionist group They Them Collective. Observers note. One of the observers covered this on last week's reporting. Participants harassed outdoor diners and police officers with bright lights while chanting, "All cops are bastards" and "Burn it down." I'm going to have to find that. I did not see that on my email. Unless I missed it. Okay, I'll look through the other emails. Anyway, observers note. A significant presence by DC Metro Police Department was successful in preventing assaults on bystanders and damage to property. This is the first in a series of disruptions planned by the They Them Collective this month. This event likely served as a propaganda tool to demonstrate that the nation's capital is not under lockdown and that leftist groups can still muster a street presence to challenge law enforcement. Of note, other leftist groups have pledged their support for the marches moving forward, as we will discuss next. Far-left youth group activities surge. The Youth Liberation Front, or YLF, is organizing simultaneous disruptions in multiple cities across their chapters on Saturday, 6 March, so 5 days ago. The event announcement calls for participants to cause chaos and to target the state. In addition, the DC chapter of the YLF has pledged their support for the They Them Collective disruptions in Washington, D.C. The YLF chapter in Seattle, Washington is supporting the Black Liberation Movement's Abolish ICE march planned for Sunday, February 14. Observers note, far-left groups will continue to cause disruptions throughout the Biden term. One of their chief goals is to provoke a government overstep or overreaction, which can be used to re-energize popular support for far-left demonstrations against law enforcement. Armed leftists in California resume public range days. Armed leftist groups in California, including the SRA and the Anarchist Rifle Association, or ARC, that would be the Socialist Rifle Association, or the Anarchist Rifle Confederation, Jesus. It's late, 12:33 a.m. Okay, so let me start that one again. Armed leftist groups in California, including the Socialist Rifle Association and the Anarchist Rifle Confederation, are again hosting range days this month as Governor Gavin Newsom lifts coronavirus restrictions. Observers note, in addition to becoming more familiar with firearms, armed leftist groups advertise and use these range days as recruiting events for prospective members and generate appealing propaganda posts on social media. Seattle police involved shooting to spark violence. Seattle Police Department, or SPD, officers shot and killed a black assailant, allegedly firing at them near the Jimi Hendrix Park and Northwest African American Museum on Monday night. Far-left groups such as the Seattle chapter of the YLF and the Pacific Northwest Revolutionary Afro Collective have already declared it a racially motivated murder. Anti-fascist and Black Lives Matter activists are organizing a retaliatory, violent disruption for tomorrow night, that'll be today, Thursday, 11 February. One anti-fascist organizer specifically called for leftists to, quote, burn this effort down and make the pigs pay. In addition, leftist intelligence support groups reported that officers were allowed to deactivate body cameras at the scene of the shooting, and activists were at the scene soon after attempting to film. Observers note, the initial meeting spot is Seattle Central College, although it's not immediately clear where disruptive efforts will occur. Far-left groups will continue to springboard off any police-involved shooting to rebuild popular support and justify the continuation of violent disruptions. Interestingly, there is an apparent division over how leftists should respond to this particular incident. Some groups have called for a delayed, non-violent demonstration at a later date in order to avoid harming the victim's family. Others claim that this will only legitimize police violence and are calling directly for violence and destruction. Given the multiple assaults and attempts of anti-fascists to murder police officers in Seattle throughout the last year, some level of far-left violence is likely. Anarchists plan to build a new radical hub in Rockford, Illinois. Anarchist bloggers posted a lessons learned article examining the far-left riots in Rockford, Illinois during the 2020 George Floyd uprising. They claimed that leftists were successful at carrying out largely symbolic attacks against gentrification, capitalism, whiteness, and that rioters contested the monopoly of violence of the Rockford police. Authors claimed that radical infrastructure was taking shape in the area and called for several actions to accelerate the far-left movement in the area and across the country. First, they called for the creation of a physical political center to serve as a hub of propaganda, affinity group coordination, radical politics education, and mutual aid logistical support. Second, they urged for the formation of additional community defense-oriented groups and claimed that mere resistance against police is not militant enough. Finally, they called for greater coordination and organization with larger, more experienced far-left groups in larger cities. Observers note, Rockford is a small city with a population of 150,000 that sits about an hour and a half northwest of downtown Chicago. In other words, it's far removed from the traditional stronghold of Chicago. This is another example of the far-left strategy to expand their center of gravity out of urban areas to suburbs and other small cities. By this plan, anarchists would build a revolutionary vanguard in Rockford, then begin building ties within the community, recruiting, and ultimately expanding the anarchist insurrection. This also underscores one of the reasons why they've used the term proto-insurgency to describe these activities. This is textbook early-stage insurgent behavior. Although they aren't prepared right now to conduct armed violence, they are absolutely building the foundations of a future insurgency should the movement decide to pursue one. YLF chapter calls for harassing restaurant patrons in Oregon. The Pacific Northwest chapter of the Youth Liberation Front called for leftist followers on social media to harass and yell at people eating out during a pandemic starting this weekend. This call is in response to Governor Kate Brown allowing the partial reopening of restaurants, gyms, movie theaters, and other businesses. Observers note, one of the most significant factors that can drive the growth of an insurgency is an economic crisis or extended period of poor economic conditions. Dissatisfaction with the government and persistent unemployment presented a prime opportunity for radicalization and recruitment of American youth. Far-left groups will likely paint the lifting of restrictions as a tax on their communities in order to undermine the legitimacy of the government. Harassing people attempting to get back to normal, however, may prove to be counterproductive to that effort. Upcoming event calendar. Today, 11 February, Fight for Black Lives, Disruption, Anti-Fascists, Seattle, Washington. 13 February, F the Police March, the They Them Collective and the Youth Liberation Front, Washington, D.C. 14 February, Abolish ICE March, the Black Liberation Movement and Youth Liberation Front, Seattle, Washington. 20 February, F the Police March, the They Them Collective and Youth Liberation Front, Washington, D.C. 27 February, F the Police March, They Them Collective, Youth Liberation Front, Washington, D.C. And finally, 6 March, Autonomous Day of Action, YLF in multiple cities. All right, that would be that. I believe I'm caught up. Yeah, so, 623 out.